The first time Lisa walked through the door, something about her didn't sit right. She was all smiles, big, exaggerated ones that stretched too wide, almost like she was trying too hard to make a good impression. She swept into the living room with an air of forced charm, calling everyone sweetie and honey, like she had known the family for years. But to him, her overly familiar behavior felt fake. Maybe it was her unnervingly perfect posture, the way she seemed to observe everything and everyone a second too long, or the way her voice was just a little too sweet, like syrup poured over something rotten. Whatever it was enough to set his nerves on edge. His father, however, seemed smitten. Widowed for a few years now, his dad had been lonely, and it was clear he had fallen head over heels for Lisa. She was younger than his dad by at least a decade, with perfectly styled blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and a constant air of confidence. To everyone else, she might have seemed like the perfect match for a man who had spent years grieving. To him, she was anything but. At first, he told himself it was nothing more than a gut feeling. It wasn't like Lisa did anything outright suspicious in the beginning. She was polite, even overly so, and she made an effort to talk to him and his two younger brothers. She brought little gifts for his 10-year-old brother, Sam, and always smiled at the toddler, Max, who adored her. But her smile had never quite reached her eyes. He couldn't explain why he didn't trust her, and that frustration gnawed at him. Every time he voiced his concerns to his dad, they were brushed aside. "You just need to give her a chance," his dad would say, his tone a little too dismissive. "She's a good woman, and I think you'll see that eventually." He wanted to believe his dad was right. He wanted to believe that his unease came from seeing someone new in their lives, someone trying to take the place of their late mother. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that Lisa was hiding something. Then, small things started to stand out, like the way she always seemed to be hovering just out of sight. He'd catch glimpses of her standing at the edge of a doorway, watching him or his brothers with a strange expression that was impossible to read. Or the way she always seemed to know when their dad wouldn't be home, finding excuses to stay over on those nights. One evening, when their dad was working late, Lisa offered to make dinner. Her cheerful demeanor didn't match the strange, almost calculating glances she kept throwing his way as she moved around the kitchen. She hummed softly to herself, her back turned, and though he couldn't pinpoint what it was, he felt an unsettling tension in the air. It wasn't just her presence that bothered him. It was the way she seemed to fill the house, subtly imposing herself into every corner of their lives. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the thought struck him like a sudden chill. Lisa wasn't just a bad fit for his dad. She was something far worse. The shift in Lisa's behavior was subtle, but once he started noticing, it became impossible to ignore. She seemed to grow bolder, as though she believed no one could see through the mask she wore. The cheerful demeanor she paraded in front of his father was still there, but when his dad wasn't around, something darker simmered beneath the surface. It started with small, strange encounters. One afternoon, he came home from school to find Lisa standing in the hallway near his dad's bedroom. She was peering into the closet, her back turned to him, and didn't notice his arrival at first. Clearing his throat, he called out, "What are you doing?" Lisa spun around, her face breaking into one of her too wide smiles. "Oh, hi, sweetie," she chirped, her tone dripping with false warmth. "I was just look for a blanket. Your dad said there might be extras in here." He didn't buy it. There were no extra blankets in his dad's closet. He knew that much. The closet was where his father kept private things, his safe, important papers, and a few valuables. Lisa's excuse felt flimsy, but before he could press her, she closed the closet door and brushed past him with that same unsettling smile. When he told his dad about it later that evening, his father simply shrugged. "She probably didn't mean anything by it," he said, dismissively waving a hand. "You're reading too much into things." But it didn't stop there. A few days later, he came home to find Lisa leaving his little brother Sam's room. This time, her smile faltered when she saw him. "Hey, sweetheart," she said, quickly regaining her composure. "I was just opening the window. It's so stuffy in here, don't you think?" Something about her explanation didn't sit right with him. After she walked downstairs, he went into Sam's room to check. Both windows were firmly shut. He frowned, trying to make sense of what she'd been doing in there, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, the incident lingered in his mind, adding to the growing pile of doubts. He tried telling his dad again, but the conversation played out just as it had before. "You've got to give her a break," his dad said with a tired sigh. "I know you don't like her, but she's not doing anything wrong." The frustration boiled inside him. How could his dad not see it? How could he ignore the strange little cracks in Lisa's perfect facade? He thought about confronting her directly, but every time he considered it, the idea made his skin crawl. There was something about Lisa's presence that unnerved him, something that told him she wouldn't react kindly if pushed, and yet, her behavior was starting to escalate. She seemed to go out of her way to interact with Sam and Max when their dad wasn't home, always with that syrupy tone and false cheer. It was as though she were trying to assert herself as part of their family in his father's absence. But to him, it felt more like an intrusion, a deliberate and calculated effort to worm her way deeper into their lives. Deep down, he knew he couldn't trust her. The question was, what was she really up to? The evening was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that feels oppressive rather than peaceful. He sat at his desk, headphones on, trying to focus on a school assignment, but the quiet tugged at his attention. Lisa was downstairs with his younger brother Max, supposedly babysitting while his dad worked late. Sam was at a friend's house, and for once he was grateful for the absence of noise from his little brother's endless energy. But then he heard it, a sharp, muffled cry from downstairs. He pulled off his headphones, straining to listen. At first, he thought it might have been Max, but the next sound chilled him to the bone. It was Lisa's voice, loud and harsh, something he had never heard before. "Stop it! Just stop crying!" she screamed, her voice brimming with anger. He froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. His heart pounded as he tried to process what he'd just heard. Then another cry, this one louder and more distressed, echoed through the house. Without thinking, he bolted out of his chair and rushed downstairs, adrenaline surging through his veins. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he saw Lisa in the living room. She was standing over Max, who was sitting on the floor, tears streaming down his tiny face. Lisa's back was to him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, and she was muttering something under her breath. Max flinched at every word, his little body trembling with fear. "Lisa!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the tense air. She whipped around, her expression startled at first, then quickly morphing into something cold and unreadable. For the first time, there was no fake smile, no saccharine sweetness, just a blank, icy look that made his stomach churn. "What are you doing home?" she asked, her tone flat. "I heard you yelling," he snapped, stepping closer. "What's going on?" Her eyes flicked to Max, then back to him. "He wouldn't stop crying," she said, her voice void of emotion. "I just lost my patience for a second. That's all." He didn't believe her. The anger he had heard in her voice was too raw, too real. "You scared him?" he said, his fists clenched. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Lisa took a step back, her expression shifting into something that almost resembled guilt, but he wasn't buying it. "I didn't mean to," she said softly, but her voice lacked sincerity. "It's been a stressful day." He knelt down and scooped Max into his arms, the little boy clinging to him tightly. Max's sobs quieted slightly, but his tiny hands trembled against his brother's chest. "Go upstairs," he told Max gently. "I'll be there in a minute." Once Max was out of sight, he turned back to Lisa. "You need to leave," he said firmly, his voice shaking with controlled anger. Lisa didn't argue. Instead, she walked past him, her face expressionless, and disappeared into the kitchen. He heard the door to the basement stairs shut softly behind her, leaving him alone in the living room with the echo of her outbursts still ringing in his ears. His hands were shaking as he pulled out his phone to call his dad. Whatever it took, he was going to make sure this woman didn't stay in their lives. But deep down, a chilling thought crept into his mind. What if she was more dangerous than he realized? The house was silent again, but this time the quiet felt oppressive, suffocating. It was well past midnight, and he was lying in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, replaying the events of the evening over and over in his head. Lisa's blank expression, her harsh voice, Max's trembling sobs, it all left a bitter taste in his mouth. His father had listened to his account over the phone, but as always, his response had been frustratingly mild. "I'll talk to her," his dad had said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "She's just under stress, that's all. You don't need to blow this out of proportion." Blow this out of proportion? The words repeated in his mind like a mocking echo. He wanted to believe his father would finally see Lisa for what she was, but a nagging part of him knew better. His dad was too blinded by loneliness, too eager to hold on to the idea that Lisa was the answer to his grief. But she wasn't. She was something far worse. Sleep refused to come. He kept glancing at the door, half expecting it to creak open. The house felt wrong, like the air itself had shifted. Every little sound, a creak in the floorboards, the rustle of leaves outside, made his pulse quicken. He rolled over, trying to convince himself that everything was fine, that Lisa wouldn't dare do anything else tonight. Then he heard it, the faintest click, barely audible, like a doorknob turning. His breath caught in his throat, and he froze, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing. Then came the soft creak of a door opening, followed by a shadow flickering against the dim moonlight leaking through his window. Someone was in his room. His heart raced as he bolted upright, his eyes darting around the darkness. For a split second, he caught sight of a figure, a silhouette, standing just inside the doorway. The shape was unmistakable. It was Lisa. "Lisa?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it stepped back into the hallway, the door clicking softly shut behind it. He sat there, frozen, his mind racing. What was she doing in his room? How long had she been standing there? And why hadn't she said anything? A cold shiver ran down his spine as he swung his legs over the side of the bed and grabbed his phone. The soft glow of the screen lit up his shaking hands as he dialed his father's number. Before the call could connect, he heard another sound. A door closing down the hall, his dad's room. Gathering every ounce of courage he had, he crept to his door and opened it just a crack. The hallway was dark, but he could hear the faint murmur of voices coming from his father's room. He stepped into the hallway, moving as silently as possible, and approached the door. Inside, his father's voice was low, almost pleading. Lisa's voice was quieter, but her tone was calm, almost too calm. He couldn't make out the words, but whatever they were discussing, it didn't feel right. He wanted to barge in, to demand answers, but fear rooted him to the spot. Finally, he retreated to his room, locking the door behind him. Lying in bed, clutching his phone, he stared at the ceiling, his heart pounding. He knew now, without a doubt, that Lisa wasn't just strange, she was dangerous. And the thought that his father couldn't, or wouldn't, see it, left him feeling more alone and vulnerable than ever before.